It is a pleasure to introduce this year's keynote guest, author and activist Jewelle Gomez. Gomez's stories, novels, poems, plays, and criticisms center on the experiences of LGBTQ women of color. Devoted philanthropist, she was the director of cultural equity and grants at San Francisco Arts Commission and the literature program for the New York State Council for the Arts. She served on the boards of the A Lesbian Foundation and the Open Meadows Foundation, both of which fund women's organizations and activities. She has also been a board member of the Cornell University Human Sexualities Archive and the advisory board of the James Hormel LGBTQ Center of the main San Francisco Public Library, and was on the founding board of the Gay and Lesbian Alliance Against Defamation. Her fiction, plays, essays, criticism, and poetry credits include the San Francisco Chronicle, the New York Times, the Village Voice, Ms. Magazine, Essence Magazine, The Advocate, Callaloo, and Black Scholar. Her work has also appeared in several anthologies, including Homegirls, Reading Black, Reading Feminist, Dark Matter, and the Oxford World Treasury of Love Stories. She has also worked in television as an original staff member of Say Brother, one of the first weekly Black television shows in the US, and on the iconic children's program, The Electric Company. She is the recipient of a literature fellowship from the National Endowment for the Arts, 2 California Arts Council fellowships, and an individual artist commission from the San Francisco Arts Commission. A few months ago, she received a Horror Writers Association Bram Stoker Legacy Award, which might actually be the coolest trophy I have ever seen. It's amazing. Her first novel, The Gilda Stories, which celebrated its 20th year in print in 2011, earned the Double Lambda Award and was an absolute pleasure to teach in my classes this semester. The novel follows the life of a Black lesbian vampire, once a runaway slave, from 1850 to 2050. By reimagining American history through the figure of the vampire and projecting a unique vision of its future, Gilda asks questions about family, power, community, and identity, about what it means to take blood, not life, and leave something in exchange. Everyone, please join me in welcoming Jewelle Gomez.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And you let me know if you have any difficulty hearing me.
Can you all hear?
Okay. Great. This is a real pleasure. This is very exciting. I'm only sad that I'm not there in person, which I have been to Albany, and I've actually been to SUNY Albany, but not in a long time. So hopefully next time I'll be able to be there in person. Thank you to those of you who were in Professor Muhlstock's classes earlier this month. We had a grand time. I felt like people asked really interesting questions. So I'm happy to be back here to either answer questions that you didn't get a chance to ask, or maybe share some other things. I do actually have the original story, which I wrote because, for my original Gilda story I wrote, which was published in the Village Voice before I even knew Gilda was going to be a novel. So it was published as a short story. And I ended up not including it in the novel because it didn't quite fit in to the narrative as I was developing it. But I've edited it, and it is going to be in the sequel, which I'm currently working on. So for those of you who read the introduction to the anniversary edition, you know where the story originated from, an attack, a verbal attack on me in the street, which enraged me. And the good news is I went right home and the adrenaline shot through my body, and I sat down at my typewriter and started writing this particular story. And I will tell you that before I read the story, that much changed between that initial impulse to write the story, which was kind of a revenge story. But as I worked on it more, I realized it had to have a deeper meaning, because revenge is such an immediate but also unsatisfying emotion and action. And so writing the story made me think about, well, what were the things I might accomplish in writing a story such as this? And I came up with several things. One is how we assist each other in our needs, how we manage to help others repair their own lives when we are faced with the horrible behavior of others. It made me think about family, how we create family, how we make those we care about into those we stay connected with. And it made me think that the stories were a way also to convey history, specifically in this story, African American history, because so much of that is lost between generations, and so much of it is so poorly taught in our schools that we don't get to understand anything more than memorizing dates and battles, as opposed to seeing the themes that run through our history and how they get acted out in the present and how we may want to change them for the future. So those are the things that I kind of thought about as I wrote this story down. I'm going to read it. Let me see how many, it's about seven minutes long. So I hope that's okay. I hope don't get too stiff sitting there. So stand up if you need to. Okay. The story is called Joe Louis Was a Heck of a Fighter. Gilda was more than alive. The 150 years she carried were flung casually around her shoulders, an intricately knit shawl handed down from previous generations, yet distinctly her own. Her legs were smooth and mocha brown, unscarred by the knife-edged years spent on a Mississippi plantation and strengthened by more recent nights dancing in speakeasies, and then discos. The paradox did not escape Gilda. Her power was forged by deprivation and decadence. The preternatural endurance that had been thrust upon her unexpectedly was now completely hers. Her grip could snap bone and bend metal, and when she ran, she was the wind, she was invincible and alone. Tonight, hurrying home, she walked anxiously, gazing at the evening skyline. It sparkled like her friend Effie's favorite necklace, which plunged liquid silver between her dark breasts. The image pushed Gilda faster through the tree-shrouded park. She glanced over her shoulder at the shadowed sidewalk, where the light from the street lamps was cast through shifting leaves. Little moved on that Manhattan Avenue, but Gilda felt danger was not far behind. Gilda had not seen any of her siblings since she'd escaped slavery more than 100 years before. Their loss was remote. She was always surprised when an image of them arose in her mind. She veered off of Broadway down to West End Avenue, where the grass sloped gently from the city street to the brackish river. The soft flowing of water played in her ears, obscuring the city sound to her left and stirring her already bubbly uneasiness. She focused her attention to steel herself against the discomfort of running water in the Hudson River, so she could enjoy the dark, textured darkness of the tree-lined avenue and try to rid herself of the images that swirled around her. Ahead, hidden from the street light by the shadows of a thick maple tree, Gilda saw a man leaning against a park fence. Her body tensed, but she felt no fear. This was a mortal, in his 20s, strongly built and obviously up to no good. He wore a sweatsuit, several sizes too large, but that did not conceal his muscled arms. The cap pulled down over his brow, meant to hide his features, only exposed his vulnerability to Gilda. She slowed her steps momentarily, then thought, he's just a man. A surprise flood of anger washed over her. She'd only recently understood such anger could be hers. Her mother, Fulani features hemmed in a placid gaze, had not been allowed that luxury. She'd been enslaved, admonished to be grateful. As a girl, Gilda had not understood. The master who owned all and was responsible for everyone never showed anger. His wife, whom he pampered and worshiped oppressively, was angry all of the time, as was the overseer, who regularly vented his anger on Black flesh. But Blacks were not thought to have anger any more than a mule or a tree cut down for kindling. Gilda looked quickly behind her and saw several apartment dwellers moving casually past their windows and a couple approaching a little more than a block behind her. The young man stood ahead of her, his intentions leering out from behind an empty grin. Gilda's step was firm. She wondered what drove men, Black, white, rich, poor, alive, or otherwise, to need to leap out at women from the darkness. As she walked past, he spoke low, almost directly in her ear. "Hey, mama, don't walk so fast." Gilda continued on, hoping he would take his loss and be quiet. He didn't. "Oh, mama, come on, be nice to me." The wheedling in his voice scraped and scratched at her. We're connected by blood, Gilda thought, as she felt the young man waiting. She understood that the poverty she saw around her ground people into hopelessness. She herself fought each day to resist the predatory impulses which seemed to ease feelings of desperation. In the man before her, she recognized his surrender to that impulse. Anger speared her, leaving a metallic taste in her mouth. Where were the words for what she felt? She stopped and turned to him, smiling as she remembered the words of an irate Chicago waitress she'd overheard decades before. "I am not your mama, and if I were, I would have drowned you at birth." She walked on. He caught up. "Why you bitches so hard? Come on, sister, give me a break." Gilda continued walking. She had no desire to let her anxiety and anger push her to the end of the night with angry blood. "Come on, sister, let me see that smile again." With that, he seized her arm. His grip would have bruised another, but Gilda shook free easily, leaving him off balance. In a smooth reach, he snatched at her close-cropped hair, hoping to pull her into the darkness. A low moan sounded in the back of her throat. She could almost feel her slim fingers clenched around his neck, snapping the connection to the spine. She replaced that sensation with the memory of a hot night 30 years before in Florida, 1950. She'd been sitting in an after-hours club watching the fighter show how he'd whipped a Tampa boy who said boxing was just a coon show. Gilda smiled again as she raised her left fist in perfect form and smashed it into the man's jaw. He fell unconscious to the cracked pavement, half sprawled on thin city grass. Gilda lifted him from the street, held him to her as the couple she'd seen earlier passed by. Once they were paces away, she lowered the man to the ground so he sat against the tree. She knelt low, hiding him from the street, and smoothly sliced the flesh behind his ear with her fingernail. His eyes opened in shock, and Gilda held him in her grip, the grip of her hands and her mind. He was pinned against the tree, its rough bark biting into his shirt, as Gilda rummaged amongst his thoughts. Confusion replaced shock, then rage followed. Unable to move, the young man bellowed internally. His ideas were petty, self-centered, ignorant of any world except the small circle in which he traveled. The history Gilda knew, the triumphs she'd seen, all meant nothing to him. She had not felt so unrelated to a mortal since she'd taken on this preternatural life. Gilda pressed her lips to the cut. Blood had begun to seep out onto his sweatshirt. The flesh was soft and smelled of sweet soap. She imagined the boy he'd been when he was still able to picture himself as part of a larger world. She drew her share of the blood for him swiftly, barely enjoying the warmth as it washed over her. His anger began to swell inside of her, wiping away the sensation of his youth. She was engorged, yet continued to take the blood, unable to stop, feeling no need to leave something for him as she had been taught. At the final moment, she pulled back, lifted herself from his neck, and looked into his almost dead eyes. She touched his nearly empty mind, searching for a tiny space where there was no anger or hatred. She found too many places seared white with disappointment. And then a small moment where a treasured memory was hidden opened up. There she planted the understanding of what it could mean to really feel love toward a sister, and from that love find a connection to the rest of the world. In the shallow cavern of his thoughts, she left him that one sensation to live for, to strive for, as she held her hand to seal the wound. His pulse was faint, but soon became steady. She lifted him gently, as if he were only napping, and laid him on the park bench. She drew the cap back so it rested on the crown of his head, but left his dark face open and smooth in the dim light. His lips were no longer curled in a smirk, but rested partly open, ready to finally speak. She could see the young man he'd once been, the young man he might still be. As she rose to leave, Gilda was glad she had such a good memory. Yeah, Joe Louis was a heck of a fighter, she said, as she turned and joined the wind. So that was the first Gilda story. I've since re-edited it, and it's much longer, and we'll see it as a chapter in my sequel. And I guess I wanted to say that the theme of that story is so much what draws me to the film we're going to see. You know, that sense of how we can connect to each other how we, even in extraordinary circumstances, can find each other's uh, bonds and affinities, even though they may be frightening, even though the unknown is frightening. And that is so much of what our culture today is struggling with. How do we find the connections to others who are so different from us, who look nothing like us, who feel nothing like us, who are people that frighten us, quite honestly? How do we find the bond that connects us rather than strike out in fear? And that's the what I got from writing that story, and what set me on the journey of the Gilda stories, and what I get from this film, the really dear way that two youngsters can connect. Even though, I mean, I don't know what I would do if I woke up and a vampire was sitting in my room. I don't know how I would feel about that. But if the one character can reach beyond that to come to understand another character who is a vampire, I feel like that's something we can all do. So.
Yeah, that's definitely something we can aspire to, that we can take from this film that we'll see in a few minutes and from your novel. So, Jewelle, I have a few questions for you. Early in our communications, we discovered a shared respect for the potential of speculative fiction as a tool for deeper understanding about reality. Because the characters that populate science fiction, archetypes of science fiction, fantasies, superheroes, monsters, all falling under the speculative fiction umbrella, because they can often function as metaphors, there's a lot they can teach us on a symbolic level about what it means to be human. The Gilda stories, your protagonists, and many of the characters we come to care about and to fear are vampires. What did vampires specifically, and speculative fiction more generally, offer you in terms of storytelling that a realist novel couldn't?
Well, as someone who grew up watching speculative fiction television, like Twilight Zone and The Outer Limits, one of the things that I understood pretty early on was if you had a message, quote unquote message, you wanted to get across, it was often easier to do that with speculative fiction. There's something about having a story placed on another planet or placed in the future or with aliens that let the viewers take in the principle of the story. I think just the classic example is the Star Trek episode, which it turns out had the first interracial kiss on television, which of course meant that that particular episode of Star Trek was banned in certain southern states. But the truth was that people watching it could imagine, because of the way it was constructed, could imagine a Black person and a white person kissing without freaking out. The structure of the stories led people to think about all the things around that kiss. So I learned that early on, and so it kind of led me to think about speculative fiction. And the other part of it is the women's movement in the 70s and 80s was full of major speculative fiction writers, from the woman who wrote *Handmaid's Tale*, which everybody is now familiar with, but there were so many other speculative fiction, feminist speculative fiction writers that really influenced me because they were trying to create or recreate a world in which women had power and which women were not preyed upon. I mean, Joanna Russ being my most favored writer, and who really encouraged me personally. So that's what led me to the idea that speculative fiction could present some of the things that I wanted to talk about. Vampires to me, specifically because I was raised by my great-grandmother, I was always very interested in history. I mean, my great-grandmother was born in 1883, and I lived with her until 1972. And so she'd seen a whole line of history that most of us couldn't quite imagine. And I got the benefit of her perspective, her seeing things from a particular perspective. And that really, it made a difference in my life because everything was on a continuum. So when I was in elementary school and the teachers tried to tell you that all Indians were dead, I knew that wasn't true because my great-grandmother had been born on Indian land in Iowa, and she carried that history and that ethnicity with her. I knew many things were possible because of the people who had come before. Who were in my family, who I knew directly. So that's one of the reasons I always thought history is so significant. It gives us a certain kind of power. So that's why I did vampires, because with vampires, you can go through all of these times, these periods, and really see how people might have lived, how people might have survived. So I intended to be fun, but also to let people know there are things that happened before we got here and we could learn from them.
It's hard to believe sometimes that the world existed before we were born, but there you go. So, Jewelle, as you know, and as many people in the audience know, I had the absolute pleasure of teaching the Gilda stories into my classes this semester. In one class, we struggled to a great extent to plot the characters on a Venn diagram with 3 bubbles, one for human, one for vampire, and one for monster, and all of those requisite gray areas in between. Ultimately, as we told you when you visited our class, we failed miserably at this, realizing that the characters in Gilda defy most structures of categorization. In this failure, though, we seem to have succeeded in acknowledging the complexities of these 3 designations, humans, vampires, monsters, and of the characters that you created. When you were writing the novel, how did you see this or any other schema for identifying or perhaps isolating these qualities? So are they categories that can or even should be isolated?
Well, I think one of the things that was most important for me as I was writing was that vampires were human first, and they were different because they were immortal. But the qualities of who they were as humans, what they had experienced as humans, was part of who they were as immortals. So I was very conscious as I was doing that. And for me, the term monster really only applied not wholesale to vampires. Monster applied to things like slave owners, slave catchers, vampires who were predatory and didn't have a connection to mortals. So I think I was working with a different circle of monsters, and which I had to think about as I wrote this chapters. Who was really a monster, and what did it mean to be mortal at one point and not mortal at another point? but always have that humanity inside of you. And that I felt like what happened for monsters is they had suppressed that humanity. And I think we see that a lot in contemporary politics, where things we would say, oh, it makes sense not to snatch little kids from their parents and put them in cages sleeping on the floor. That would be humanity speaking. But we see a lot of characters who have cut their contact with humanity. And so those are the monsters for me.
And the students will correct me if I'm wrong. I think on that Venn diagram, monster was the easiest one for us. And I believe we only had 3 characters in that, maybe 4, in that category, 3 of them being human. Only 1 being a vampire. There are so many traditional aspects of vampire lore that show up in this novel, but with a modern twist. For instance, Gilda saving herself by placing a wooden-handled knife on her chest, where traditionally we would see a stake. Or vampires stitching soil of their homelands into the lining of their clothing and into their beds, which are much easier to travel with than Dracula's many, many coffins full of Transylvanian soil. So in the process of creating your modern take on these ancient vampires, what aspects of tradition affected or attracted you to the vampire? And which did you need to revise to update to fit your vampire characters?
I think the first bit of the mythology that really attracted me was the idea of the soil. I'm actually an earth sign. But there's something about how you carry your home soil with you and how much land, the ramifications of land in the lives of people of color in this country, starting with Native Americans having their land stolen and renamed. Then going on to Africans being removed from their homeland, and the attempt to really divest them of any of the cultural elements of homeland. That is, it's very frightening. I mean, and if you look at Chinese people, men brought to the US to build US railroads, but refused the opportunity to bring their wives. And another way to disconnect them from homeland and refuse the opportunity to create home in this new land. So the idea of homeland and soil really resonated for me in many, many ways. And I wanted to look at how that would play out for a character like Gilda and Bird and the original Gilda. Let's see, I did have to really think about all of these mythologies because so many of them, as we know them, coming from Dracula and other Victorian era stories, so many of them were based in Christianity. And I wanted this vampire lore to precede Christian mythology. If we can assume that vampires live forever, I can assume that they lived way before the Common Era. And so I felt like a lot of the mythology was based on the idea of souls, that basic thing that one of the reasons that vampires cannot see themselves in mirrors in most traditional mythology is because it was thought that vampires had no souls. And I thought, who gets to tell you you have a soul or you don't? It didn't really resonate for me. And so I did away with that. as an element. On the other hand, there's a thing about, which I read about in the story I just read, the thing about moving water and vampires having difficulty crossing moving water. And it seemed to make sense to me because the human body is what, 99% water. So if you're going to deal with a being whose corporeal makeup is so much water and who is tethered to reality in such a magical way that they would have difficulty crossing running water made perfect sense to me, and gave me the opportunity to, in some areas, use that as a plot device. So, there's all kinds of ways that vampire mythology historically has been based in a white middle class or upper middle class Christian sensibility that didn't really jibe with the vampire mythology of so many other cultures, because there is vampire mythology in every culture, pre-literate and beyond. So it was fun to pick out the things that worked for me. And feel like I wasn't betraying a whole mythos, because I think people want to feel connected to the vampire mythology, one as it used to exist, and then again as it exists today. So.
Well, in a lot of ways, you were really ahead of your time with this novel. I don't just mean projecting into a future that didn't exist yet. You have chapters set in 2020, 2050. You sort of predicted where vampires were going in pop culture to a certain extent. My personal favorite change that you made to vampire lore and vampire tradition is the idea of the exchange. That we take blood, not life, and leave something in return. I was really struck in the piece you read earlier that she didn't leave something in return, if I heard you correctly, or there was a debate.
No. In the story I just read?
Yeah. Was she debating for a minute, or did I miss it?
No, she did. She left, she looked inside of him and left an idea of what it would be like to really have a sister and how he could use that to come back to humanity.
Yeah, so this idea of the exchange, it's unlike anything we saw in vampire lore, mythology, pop culture before this novel, and really since. Even these hypersexual teenage vampires on TV and in teen TV and the teenage gothic that survive off of rodents and donated blood. This idea of the exchange is still entirely unique to your novel. Can you talk to our audience a little bit about what that idea is and where it came from?
Yeah. Well, of course, it's a really old idea. I mean, it's very much present in Native American culture, in feminist culture. And when I was working on it, my editor, Nancy Bariano, who was the founder of Firebrand Books, which did the original production of the novel. And we spent a year kind of editing all of the chapters. And she early on said, Jewelle, I don't know, do you want to write a story, a novel about a serial killer? And I thought, oh no, you're right. That's kind of what I'm doing, isn't it? And I had tried to make it like, in some ways, like Dexter, where Dexter, the serial killer, only kills bad people. I had, in many ways in the beginning, I had tried to do that. And then I thought, no, it's really not, that's not what I want. You're right. And so I had to go back and examine, if she doesn't kill people, what does she do? And what does she do that's interesting? Because let's face it, a battle on the page is kind of exciting, and good triumphing over evil is kind of exciting. But if she's not going to kill them, what's going to happen that's going to be interesting? And I thought a lot about it, and that's what I came up with, that idea of you, in order to really be true to yourself as a vampire, blood taking must be an exchange. You can't just take the blood. You have to leave something that will help other people. It also felt good to me because I didn't want Gilda to necessarily come across as this superhero. Oh, she can show up in your life. She can solve your problems. She'll find you a new girlfriend. She'll find you a job. I wanted it to be much more like she can help you find what's inside of you that will help you find a new girlfriend and find a new job. And because that's what we're all looking for, whatever it is that's inside of us, that's going to make life better for us. So the exchange was really, I'm thankful to Nancy Bariano for asking that question about a serial killer, because it made me work harder and add another dimension to the story.
And what a great dimension. It's so unique and so beautiful, and again, just tells us so much about the potential of humanity. So I
think politically, I would add something else. I watch, and I've read almost every vampire novel ever written. And, and you start with Interview with the Vampire and you go on to some of the others. And particularly with Interview, it's like the vampire feels so guilty when he has to take blood and people die. And I feel like that is an intense metaphor for liberals, for do-gooders. They feel so guilty about what has happened in the history in the past, but they keep acting the same. And so I did not want to have that repeated. Vampire takes your life and feels bad and moves on to take another life. That was not working.
Oh, that's great.
So I have one more question before we move to your introduction to the film. But first, I want to call attention to your outfit, which is fantastic and thematic. I love the dual collar, the red lining, the jewel. Beautiful. You're welcome. So in the forward to the anniversary edition of Gilda, which you did mention earlier, you tell the story of how the novel was born in a moment of indignation after assaults. The novel seems to come out of that moment as writing as activism and embody it throughout. Throughout the centuries documented in the novel, including those that had not or still have not occurred, Gilda illuminates the shadows that exist in the corners of our culture. Slavery, racism, homophobia, misogyny, poverty, addiction, hatred, and bigotry of all forms. You predicted so much about where we would end up. Climate crisis, video chats, flights to and from the cities. And yet your novel also shows us the best parts of humanity. Family, empathy, shared dreams. Your brand of writing as activism seems not just a call for change, but a reminder of what to keep as well. I really appreciated that. We have so many students and young people in the audience today. I was hoping you would speak for a moment to those in the audience who might want to use their own voices and their own writing as a form of activism. What advice do you have for us about the ethics and responsibility of such important work? How can we create our own forms of Gilda, our own texts that illuminate and speak to the dark corners we experience and witness, while still instilling hope for the best parts of humanity?
One of the most important things for all of us is something Harvey Milk said, you got to give them hope. And I think that is one of the biggest things that we need to hold on to. And it's very hard. If you watch any of the news, if you see what's going on outside your door, if you see the callousness with which human beings treat each other, from, breaking up with your lover on Instagram to ignoring people who are sleeping on the sidewalk in your neighborhood, to, mistreatment of each other in physical and psychologically abusive ways. I mean, if you just look at those things, it's easy to think human beings are really for shit. Why am I bothering? And part of that is how media presents the world to us. And part of that is just, a lot of human beings are for shit. But I think it behooves us to try to find the places where we see hope. They're out there everywhere. They're out there, but we have to look for them. And even if it's only in the circle of people we know, reminders when friends show up for other friends who've been sick or are short on cash and need some money to catch up on their bill, or help you study to finish your homework for a class. I mean, that's a big deal. That's a big deal for all of us. And we can all find those little pieces of hope and build on them. But it's not that easy because the external world is barraging us with a sense of hopelessness. I mean, one of the worst elements, and I've tried to cut this from my life, is when I'm watching TV and the shows are so dark and so negative, by the end, I'm feeling so depressed. And I just, I say, okay, you know what? I don't need to see another episode of that. What I want to, and it's not like I'm a Pollyanna. I got the Horror Writers Association Award. I'm not a Pollyanna. But what I want to do is figure out how I can bring hope into my life. And I think for younger people, that you're in school is a way to think about hope already, because it means you've decided you have something to give back to the world. And your education is going to help you do that. I mean, that in itself is kind of hopeful. If you think about the last summer with the Black Lives Matter demonstrations, that was one of the most hopeful moments in our history since the Civil Rights Movement when I grew up. The idea that people came all across the country, all across the world, people went out into the streets and decided to have their voices heard so that they could say, no, actually, it's not all right to kill a man on the street because you didn't like what he was doing or saying. It's just not okay. And I found that so helpful because everybody was there, every age, every ethnicity, all walks of life. It was a chance to see what could happen if we decided to work together to do something for ourselves. So I challenge everybody, look for those moments of hope. And it doesn't have to be a huge thing. Maybe there's something you volunteer for in your community that helps young people who have no opportunities, helps them read, helps them play basketball. Maybe you volunteer to help homeless people with their clothing. I mean, there's all kinds of opportunities. And if we don't take those opportunities to find hope, then we're just going to be depressed and or simply callous. And I challenge people to find those places where you can find hope and keep it alive in your life. I mean, I can't give you a how-to, but it's there's a belief that gratitude is one of the most effective emotions in our lives. Being grateful for what you have, what you know. So if you can both be grateful and find hope, you're gonna do big things in our world.
And having met a fair few of them, I have to say they are full of hope and they fill me with hope. And I am terribly grateful that you are going to introduce one of my favorite vampire films, Thomas Anderson's Let the Right One In. What do you have to tell us about this film that we're about to watch?
Okay, well, I don't want to say too much because you get to see it, but the thing about it, and the reason I'm so very specific about this version as opposed to the US remake, is that I think the original version is Swedish, and it's so much more, has so many more subtleties about the emotional context of young people. It has a darkness that is not unrelieved. The Swedish have a really good handle on darkness. Think about the films of Ingmar Bergman. I mean, they got darkness that can whack you in your head and leave you unconscious. But this sense of darkness is ameliorated by the ideas of the young people in it. And I think that having a gender fluid kid who's you just don't, who are they, where are they going? I think that was way before its time in cinema, certainly. And that makes the film even more moving to me. The idea of bullying and how young kids act out what they learn in their families at home is so radical and still so common in our culture. I mean, I draw a direct line from in-school bullying to in-school shooters. And I think if we do not deal with that, we're just going to have more of these shootings that claim the lives of our teachers and our young kids. And the other part, I mean, the final part is the concept of friendship. That's the other part of it that's really meaningful to me. I'm still friends with the woman who was my best friend in high school. She lives on the other side of the country from me. And we decided we loved each other and wanted to remain friends. And so we have. I'm still friends with this couple that I've known for 40 years. And fortunately, the internet makes all of this easier. But it's a decision that we care about each other, we know each other, we value each other. And that's really harder as you get older. Once you leave college, who from your college days is going to remain your friend? Who knows you well enough that you don't want to lose them as a friend? These are conscious choices that we make as we grow and go out into the world. And so this idea of friendship to me is really, really important. And we're not that conscious of it when we're in our 20s. We just think, oh, these are my pals. I hang out with them. I get high with them. I go to movies with them. I eat pizza with them. And then the next thing you know, you graduate, and who do you hear from? And it really is on you to decide who you want to hear from. So those are the things that are most exciting to me in the film. And of course, the vampire element of too. That goes without saying.
Well, it's a beautiful film. I'm so excited that we're about to watch it. We'll take a short break, a 5-minute break to use the restroom before we start the film. And please stay after the film. We'll have an open discussion facilitated by Jewelle Gomez. All right, so go take a break.